You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, Lend-Lease, our summer podcast spinoff. We're recording this on Sunday, August 11th, 2019. This is our long-awaited American Anarchy episode about anarchism and syndicalist movements in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States. Continuing with part two of our American anarchist and syndicalist episode, we're going to talk this time about this issue of violence and propaganda of the deed. We're going to talk about the role of immigrants and the Sacco and Vanzetti controversy. We're going to talk about the first Red Scare and criminal legislation. So, Nate, get us started by talking about the Haymarket affair and what happened there, which I think is sort of a key moment in the American left as a whole, and very influential on a lot of like how we think about the American left and how they thought about themselves.
Well, according to historian William Edelman, no single event has influenced the history of labor in Illinois, the United States, and even the world more than the Chicago Haymarket affair. So, I'd say it's a pretty foundational event. And of course, with all the stuff about May Day and everything there. So, and I feel like a lot of our listeners, know what the Haymarket affair, Haymarket riot, all whatever you want to call it, what that is generally. But just to give some context, of course, this is in the midst of a lot of labor campaigns against sweatshops, child labor, various factory conditions, and of course, a lot of immigrants were getting paid, like $1.50 a day, working 60 hours a week. So this led to lots of campaigns for the 8-hour day with no cut in pay was the slogan. And so, in Chicago, think of the various factories that are there, like the meat packing. I don't know exactly what the industry composition was at that exact moment, but it was a huge battleground there. So at certain times there was maybe like 30 to 40,000 people on strike in Chicago alone at the time of the Haymarket riot. So obviously this is there's a lot of sort of agitation, and I didn't really know too much about this coming across the McCormick strike there. There was the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, and there were strikers, and they rushed out to confront some strike breakers who were sent in to take the jobs or try to break up any sort of labor agitation, and the police opened fire on the workers, killing 2 and wounding others. So this was sort of like the spark that led to a lot of this, I guess maybe from the police feared revolution or something like that, or you had lots of these anarchist papers. One was the Workers' Times, published by August Spies. And it had on the top bold letters, "Revenge, working men, to arms." And so this basically led to the whole famous protest in Haymarket Square there. So, there was a lot of pamphleting, and there was, thousands came out to the rally, although initially apparently it was claimed to be, or they thought it was going to be like 20,000. But basically, maybe around 2,500 attended. So, not a small crowd necessarily, but not necessarily the giant swell expected. And so, there were some people that didn't show up. It was raining. There were people that they came at the last minute because they had been attending a meeting of sewing workers organized by Lucy Parsons, who we're going to talk about more in detail. But so it was sort of, your typical protest, speechifying, things are going on, and it was almost over. And only about 200 people were apparently remaining. I didn't really know that as much just from the history, and some of these pictures that I'm looking at here sort of paint a different picture. But basically then they were attacked by 176 policemen carrying Winchester repeating rifles, and apparently they were more upset about this one speaker in particular, I guess Samuel Phelan, who was a Methodist lay preacher who worked in the labor movement. I guess there was they thought him in particular, he had been calling for violence more. I guess he did say it would be as well for us to die fighting as to starve to death. Fielden told the crowd before crying out, "Exterminate the capitalists." So, I
I
can
thought you were
see.
going to say that he gave an all cats are beautiful speech, and this incensed the cops so much that they
Well,
had to open fire.
so basically, then they were like, "Oh, I command in the name of the law to desist and you to disperse." Nobody moved, and then Fielden said, "We are peaceable." So, got to be careful with the words a little bit there. And then, of course, there was the bomb that was thrown, and to this date, it's not really known who exactly threw it. Some people claim it was a police agitator. Others, try to track down the anarchists that did it. We probably don't know, but it was apparently there was like a streak of fire throughout the night sky or whatever, or just like as it was being thrown. And this, there's all these evocative images of it, like all these policemen, and then there's like this light emanating from the center of them, and they're getting blown up. And there were, I forget exactly how many policemen were killed. Several on the front line were killed. And then people started running. There was a panic. People were trampled. And a lot of people were shot dead just by the police from gunfire, just shooting through the smoke, sort of. So well over 100 total were injured and 11 were dead, including 7 police officers and 4 citizens. So basically a lot of chaos, a lot of, it's very unclear, and it's very difficult now with over 100 years past to figure out exactly the details of what happened that night. But it definitely set up this Red Scare, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about the whole trial aspect of that. But that is sort of the basics of what actually went down.
Yeah, so Rachel, could you talk about some of these women that emerge as very prominent figures around Haymarket? Some of them were already well known in sort of anarchist circles, but some of them, like Goldman, this is when they have their awakening, basically.
So the two of the major players are Lucy Parsons and Lizzie Holmes. So Lucy Parsons was a Latinx indigenous revolutionary anarchist from Texas who moved to Chicago with her white husband, who was executed for the Haymarket bombing. She also was one of the co-founders of the IWW. She was a comrade of Lizzie Holmes, who was also a key figure in the labor movement in Chicago. She worked with the Knights of Labor and the International Working People's Association. And in addition to being a labor organizer, she was the writer and editor in various radical and anarchist newspapers. She worked as the assistant editor of The Alarm, and she published articles in Lucifer the Light Bearer, which is my new favorite newspaper title, Freedom and Free Society. In contrast to some of her contemporaries, Lizzie Holmes was also willing to publish in more conservative outlets, which led to her publishing a string of articles in the American Federation of Labor-affiliated journal American Federationist. She published articles on a diverse array of topics, including free love, marriage, gender inequality, and economic justice. She also wrote multiple works of fiction, including a full-length novel entitled Hagar Linden, or A Woman's Rebellion. And along with Lucy Parsons, she fought for and demonstrated the validity of gender equality within the anarchist and broader labor movement. She was recognized as an early pioneer of anarchist feminism and an influence on more prominent thinkers like Emma Goldman. So I think something to point out is the fact that anarchists were really forward-thinking in terms of gender equality and racial equality, and even topics like free love, and marriage, and how those institutions worked in society. And I feel like a lot of the backlash against the anarchist movement really kind of pushed those those other topics aside in American society. So we didn't really get a lot of feminist thinkers until the 70s, I want to say, the first wave, the second wave feminists of the 60s and 70s. So it's kind of interesting to see how the pushback against the left also pushed some of those topics to the side as well. So kind of interesting. And speaking of Emma Goldman as well, she's kind of the most prominent, I would say, anarchist feminist in American history. She was actually attracted to anarchism after the Haymarket Affair. She was a writer and renowned lecturer on anarchist philosophy, women's rights, and social issues. She was a frequent collaborator with Alexander Berkman, who was her one-time lover and lifelong friend. She planned to assassinate industrialist and financier Henry Clay Frick as an act of propaganda of the deed, which I guess we're going to discuss more in detail later. Frick survived the attempt on his life in 1892, and Berkman was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Emma Goldman was imprisoned several times in the years that followed for, quote, inciting to riot and also illegally distributing information about birth control. In 1906, Goldman founded the anarchist journal Mother Earth. In 1917, Goldman and Berkman were sentenced to 2 years in jail for conspiring to induce persons not to register for the newly instated draft for World War I. After their release from prison, they were arrested along with 248 others and deported to Russia. They were initially supportive of the October Revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power. However, they later denounced the Soviet Union for its violent repression of independent voices and authoritarianism. She left the Soviet Union and in 1923 published a book about her experiences titled My Disillusionment in Russia. Berkman also wrote a book called The Bolshevist Myth. So both pretty disillusioned with the way things went in the Soviet Union after the revolution. While living in England, Canada, and France, Emma Goldman wrote an autobiography called Living My Life, which was published in 2 volumes in 1931 and 1935. After the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Goldman traveled to Spain to support the anarchist revolution there, and she lived a pretty long life and died in Toronto in 1940, aged 70. A lot of these anarchist women actually lived to a pretty long age and were able to have long careers as anarchist feminists. During her life, Goldman was lionized as a free-thinking rebel woman, or rebel girl, as we have been saying, by admirers, and denounced by detractors as an advocate of politically motivated murder and violent revolution. Her writing and lectures spanned a wide variety of issues, including prisons, atheism, freedom of speech, militarism, capitalism, marriage, free love, and homosexuality. And although she distanced herself from first-wave feminism and its efforts towards suffrage, she developed new ways of incorporating gender politics into anarchism. And she later gained iconic status in the 1970s by a revival of interest in her life when feminists and anarchist scholars rekindled popular interest. And I just want to point out, I did study some of her writings in college. I took a feminist philosophy course, and I feel like because I didn't have a lot of this like foundational background knowledge, I really didn't absorb a lot of what she had to say in her writings. And I think that's kind of an indictment on how history is taught, especially American history in the US at the high school level, because I didn't really know much about her and much about her life. So I couldn't really absorb her philosophy in the context in which she wrote it. So it's kind of unfortunate. And I wish I still had the books, but I think I sold them back for pennies on the dollar because that's what you do in college.
Yeah, that never works out.
Yeah, exactly.
My advice to people would just be to keep all the books. You might want to read them later or give them away or whatever, because you're not going to get value back and they're charging you ridiculous markups in the first place. So.
Yeah, I really wish I had the anthology or whatever I had that had her writings in it, because I would love to revisit her writings and kind of absorb more of that context.
Yeah, and I mean, as we were talking about earlier with Mother Jones, like there's a context here for a lot of this, right? And if you don't have the context, if your only sort of fragmentary context for someone like Emma Goldman is, well, she liked assassinations, and she was a rockin' anarchist lady, like, and you don't really know what that means. Like, it's hard to probably understand her philosophy. And again, as with Mother Jones, it can be hard to understand why they're not, terribly interested in female suffrage, because that's not the ideology they subscribe to, right? You're not interested in getting the vote if you're dreaming of a utopian post-revolutionary state where voting is not a concept, and that's not how the system works. So Nate, did you want to briefly talk about sort of the Haymarket aftermath of the trial and so forth, and the influence that it had on things like May Day and that sort of thing?
Right. So basically, there was a large amount of outrage over the conduct of the police after the affair. Basically, they were just going in and like wrecking up any like buildings that could theoretically be involved with any anarchist or communist group. So they basically struck down the need for search warrants. Dozens were arrested who weren't even connected to really anything, just based on suspicion or whatever. But eventually 8 men were put on trial, who are all employees of the Workers' Times. And basically there was no evidence that any of them thrown the bomb. And then there was the whole... Some of them were commuted, I believe, but several were hung. 4 were hung. And then there was the issue of the guy who got, I think it was Louis Ling. He got some sort of blasting cap and like blew his head half off in the jail cell. But there was like, he might have been pardoned or something. Like he was maybe waiting on a pardon.
A mysterious death in jail while awaiting trial. He surely committed suicide and did not have a government interest in some other outcome.
Yeah, well, and then that's also like, who even knows? Like at this point, it just, the whole situation, that you had the Chicago Tribune talking about how, we'll pay the jury for their guilty verdict. Eventually, I guess the governor, John P. Elkeld, in 1893, pardoned the 3 men still alive and condemned the entire judicial system for its injustice. So I guess there was some sort of switch over. I don't know what the political background there is of Elkeld, but it seems like there was some regret maybe in the city, because it kind of seemed like it led to an upsurge in labor activism. And of course, the whole foundation of the May Day, although that's not our Labor Day, quote unquote Labor Day.
Right, we had to come up with a parallel Labor Day to diffuse sentiment around May Day. Very cool.
And you do have, and apparently there was some history going to the 80s. 1986 marked the centennial of the 8-hour workday and the Haymarket Affair. So you had like Pete Seeger and people making songs about this. And there was, a large amount of remembrance. And I think that the Haymarket Affair is still being taught as a pretty foundational event in American history, even though, as we've discussed, the history isn't always the best it could be. But maybe in comparison to some of these other labor strikes we've talked about, at least the Haymarket Affair left enough of an impact that, there's book companies named after it now. It still looms large in the American imagination. So it seems like it did have a pretty significant impact.
Well, before we get back to this issue of violence and this propaganda of the deed concept that was associated with people like Emma Goldman, I wanted to talk about another sort of very unjust trial of anarchists, the other really famous trial, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which is something that I think does get taught in Massachusetts. But again, as Rachel alluded to earlier, there's a difference between sort of teaching something and teaching it with the full context. And this is, a much later one, and we're talking with Haymarket, we're talking 1880s. In this case, we're talking 1920s. So a different time period, different context. As we talked about in part 1, the role of immigrants, especially in the eastern cities, is hugely important on anarchism, syndicalism in the United States. And as we had talked about with, Bertrand Russell's commentary in 1918, syndicalist ideas tended to be more popular in places like Italy at the time than against, say, communist competing ideas. And so understanding that context is critical to understanding the context around the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. So Italian Americans heavily influenced anarchism in the United States, especially during the period of 1900 to 1915, when there was a 3 million strong migration from Italy to the United States. And of course, then the immigration wave cuts off fairly abruptly as World War I breaks out. Nearly half of Italian immigrants from 1905 to 1920 returned to Italy, unlike Irish or Scandinavian migrants to the U.S. So we're not just talking about these are recently arrived. We're also talking about people who are incredibly transient and potentially were going right back and coming back and forth multiple times even. That's a very different situation than some of these other immigrant populations in the United States, and that's also hugely influential on both their political outlook as well as the sort of the need to organize around more transient populations in a way that the craft unions typically did not and could not and would not. But it's also critical to remember that Italian unification was also only completed by the Northern Monarchy in 1871, and Italy remained heavily regionally fragmented even by the turn of the century, with different dialects, politics, and rural versus urban industrial backgrounds. From 1880 to 1900, Italian immigration in particular tended to be from the impoverished former Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in southern Italy. That'd be Naples, Apulia, and so forth, as well as the island of Sicily itself. This contrasts with industrial northern Italian cities. Not all politically active Italians who came to the U.S. shared the views of anarchist immigrants. As early as the 1890s, large numbers of Italian Americans had already moved into public sector roles in places like New York City and Chicago, with which they are now stereotypically associated. So that's when you start seeing the rise of the, urban Italian garbage crews and so forth, and then later, eventually, a lot of Italians joining the police force. But again, it's important to distinguish here that we're talking about different populations of Italians. We're talking about northern Italians from industrial cities. Some of them, if they were leftists, tended to be more communist in many cases. And then we're talking about a lot of these rural farm worker people coming and suddenly becoming factory workers in the United States after leaving southern Italy, but potentially also going back. Many rural Italian Americans opted to remain in American cities in more transient manual labor jobs and avoided settling down to continue to farm. This contrasts with a lot of other types of immigrants and ethnicities who would, arrive at a place like Ellis Island or whatever port of entry, but then relocate to the American frontier and start homesteading. They were overwhelmingly male. They usually did not bring the rest of their families with them during this period, although, of course, there are some very notable exceptions, like the women who were working during the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, who were Italian or Jewish women and girls, and were active in the trade union movement inside the factory. Italian-American political alignment and position began shifting significantly during World War I and with the interwar changes in immigration law. Eventually, in Northampton, Massachusetts, in September 1939, at the start of World War II, Italian-American anti-fascists formed the Mazzini Society, dedicated to democratic republicanism and the removal of Mussolini, but they were reluctant to invite anti-fascists of the communist and anarchist persuasion. Now, that's obviously beyond the scope of the time period that we're talking about, but it's important to sort of understand the arc that was happening in the interwar period when the Sacco and Vanzetti trial happens. It's also worth noting that Mussolini was someone who started out as an Italian anarcho-syndicalist, and his original sort of conception of fascism was a nationalist syndicalist vision, which is not really what syndicalism is. By definition, there's no nation and no state under syndicalism or anarchism, so it's sort of a contradiction in terms, much in the way that calling National Socialism in Germany isn't really have anything to do with socialism. It's more of a branding exercise. But you see traces of it in Mussolini's Italian fascism, in that he was trying to organize the economy into syndicates, where everyone was organized along an entire industry's lines. Yeah.
Well, there are national syndicalists and national anarchists too, as well. And yeah, but as you were saying, Bill,
but it's more of an offshoot.
Well, yeah, but they do try to borrow at least some of the phraseology or whatever, if not the actual organizational basis or whatever. Right.
So, Nate, I was wondering, do you remember when you first heard about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial? I remember I was in 4th grade. There was a
probably somewhere around there. Yeah.
We had to go to a museum. There was a short-lived museum on like the immigrant experience in Boston, and they had a whole section on that. But I feel like they kind of, it's sort of, they don't really grapple very well with the anarchist elements of this because they were anarchists, but like, again, as we'll talk about, there's this propaganda of the deed stuff with assassinations and bombings, and that doesn't necessarily like, that it was easy to paint people like them as being part of that, but that's not necessarily a full understanding of what anarchism as an ideology is and so forth, which is of course what we've been talking about on this, on these episodes here. Sacco was from Apulia in southern Italy. Vanzetti was actually a northern Italian from Piedmont. They were somewhat associated with Gallianism, but kind of not. I mean, it was less that they were associated with it as that the Gallianists tried to associate themselves with Sacco and Vanzetti. And the Gallianists were extremists of the propaganda of the deed variety, which we'll talk about in a bit. That was a group that, in comparison to someone like Sacco and Vanzetti, they would blow themselves up. They would blow up random civilian bystanders. They were operating from 1914 to 1920. They did a bombing in Franklin, Massachusetts in 1919. These were intended to target high-profile ruling class people. The problem for Sacco and Vanzetti is that when they get arrested for this alleged robbery gone wrong, there were two different robberies, but one of them, there was a robbery gone wrong and somebody ended up dead. They get arrested for that. They are associated contextually with this Italian anarchist bombing campaign that's been happening in the years leading up to this in 1920. And in fact, the Gallianists tried to stage bombing attacks all across the U.S. in retaliation for the indictments, which didn't really work out either. They were notoriously a pretty incompetent terrorist group, a lot of real Four Lions energy they were bringing to it. There were two separate trials for separate crimes in separate jurisdictions. Judge Webster Thayer was a known xenophobe and had just given an anti-Bolshevik speech before these 1920 trials get underway. A court interpreter did not understand the relevant dialects of Italian. He knew some Italian dialects, but not all of them. This hampered the defense's ability to call witnesses and correctly relay their testimony to a jury of all basically non-Italians. The jury also tampered with physical evidence while deliberating their verdict, and part of their first case had to be thrown out. In the death penalty case for the murder, they were represented by a radical IWW lawyer who went over even worse with Judge Thayer than the other defense lawyer they had had in the first case. When Sacco and Vanzetti testified in the second case, they didn't testify at all in the first case. They rambled a lot trying to explain their political views instead of just not talking about it. They had also skipped the draft in 1917 during World War I and hid out in Mexico. That did not go over well with the judge or the jury. And that's an important context as well for this trial, is that this is happening in the aftermath of a lot of anarchist resistance to World War I and the U.S. entry to World War I. We know now that they definitely did not do the crimes that they were accused of. Sacco literally was not present anywhere near the murder he was charged for. He was inside the Italian consulate in Boston at the time of the murder. Consular staff backed that up, but were unable to be present at the trial. They had basically gotten sent home to Italy for unrelated reasons and were not going to just make a trip to the U.S. To testify on this, but we know for sure that Sacco could not have been there. Prosecutors also insisted, much like the OJ trial, that an article of clothing recovered from the crime scene that literally did not fit Sacco's head, it was some sort of a hat or a cap, was proof of his guilt. And it, again, did not fit on his head. Apparently, the defense attorney did not think to say, if it does not fit, you must acquit. 60 cities in Italy held protests against the guilty verdicts. Mussolini, who had then come to power at this point, personally tried to intervene in the case behind the scenes to seek a commutation from the Massachusetts governor. By contrast, within the U.S., they did not actually become famous until well after their conviction, but did so as the appeals process dragged on and on across the 1920s, and supporters began politicizing it more heavily, especially among the Italian immigrant communities located across the country. In 1925, they were still in the appeals process. A different robber confessed to the murder, and it turned out that he had a close associate who looked a lot like Sacco. That gang had a specific MO and history of knocking over shoe factories for cash, which was what had happened in these robberies. The defense was still unable to get a new trial given to them, despite the fact that it was increasingly obvious that it was a complete frame job. And the Boston Herald, which was and remains fairly right-wing, actually at that point called for a new trial. Every other local paper remained steadfast that justice had been done. And then, later on, after the executions and so forth in 1977, 50 years after the execution, Mike Dukakis proclaimed a memorial day for them and said they had been unjustly convicted. He did not issue posthumous pardons because he said that pardons are just for guilt. They were eventually executed despite the fact that they clearly didn't do the crimes, and they were not just considered martyrs in Italy and in the Italian-American community, but also in the Soviet Union. There are lots of streets named after Sacco and Vanzetti in Russia. Rachel, did you want to talk here? There's a bullet point I've got in the outline about a protest related to the Sacco and Vanzetti trial in Colorado in a mining town here in August 1927. This was sort of an unusual situation, but sort of a reaction to the Sacco and Vanzetti thing ended up spurring a much larger situation.
So in August 1927, a wobbly-led protest in a Colorado mining town saw so many miners walk off the job to protest the approaching execution. It triggered a statewide coal mine strike. So it wasn't a united mine workers strike, partly because that union's presence had collapsed after the Ludlow massacre in 1914, when the National Guard gunned down 12 children and 8 adults in a tent camp of striking miners and their families. So the IWW presence in Colorado was also more heavily Latino, not Italian, like some places, but was standing in solidarity. The strike included a lot of interesting tactical experiments, including an abortive idea to launch a syndicalist workers' cooperative-owned mine in an abandoned mine, though they couldn't work out how to comply with regulations enough not to be shut down immediately if they tried it. The Wobblies also held firm when machine guns were brought in against them, and a massacre occurred again. They eventually won a $1 pay raise. But unfortunately, because of the IWW's ideological commitment to decentralization and resistance to formalized union recognition or union contracts, they weren't able to maintain or sustain the level of organizing they reached in the 1927 strike, which seems to be a common refrain around the IWW's strike actions.
Yeah, and as Bertrand Russell had said in that 1918 thing, he was quoting the IWW secretary, there is but one bargain the IWW will make with the employing class: complete surrender of all control of industry to the organized workers. And I think that sort of sums up their attitude and why, they would have a success, whether it was in Lawrence or in Colorado in this case, and then they would struggle to really sustain organization, even if they had broad popular support from the public. So that is sort of the Sacco and Vanzetti story, but we should loop back at this point to talk about the propaganda of the deed and the issue of violence. So one of the reasons that a lot of the Italians and people like Sacco and Vanzetti would be accused of being associated with these, Gallianist bombers and these propaganda of the deed attacks is that propaganda of the deed was associated with Italians specifically as a theoretical sort of philosophy, although certainly a lot of other people used it as well, as we'll talk about. The Italian socialist Duke Carlo Piscane, I'm not clear on how you are a socialist duke, but I guess we saw Lord Bertrand Russell doing his socialism too. He invented this as a philosophical concept. The concept was that acts of violence could draw attention to a cause and educate people on the need for revolutionary change. Ideas result from deeds, not the latter from the former, and the people will not be free when they are educated, but educated when they are free. This was obviously, as you can understand, a pretty controversial philosophy. But how did it get brought to the United States? Well, interestingly, it actually got popularized in the United States not by an Italian first, but by a German-American, Johann Most. Now, Nate and I have been talking for a few weeks about the fact that Johann Most's grandson was a famous play-by-play radio guy for the Boston Celtics, right?
Johnny Most. I won't try to do the voice, but he has a delightfully crackly, like 10 packs of Marlboro type of voice. So just watch some YouTube clips.
So we talked earlier about how a lot of Germans tended to not be in favor of anarchism or did not really subscribe to that. They tended to be much more associated with parliamentary socialism and that sort of thing. He did not come from that background, and that is not the philosophy that he adopted in life. He was an atheist with a brutal childhood. He organized his first strike at age 12 of students. He was expelled from Germany and from the Social Democratic Party of Germany for his increasingly radical views that eventually turned completely against parliamentary socialism, although he had at one time been an SDP MP in the Imperial Reichstag, and he became in favor of violent revolutionary anarchism. He began publicly hyping up Piscane's propaganda of the deed concept. He called it Attentat in German, in the aftermath of the far-left terrorist group People's Will assassinating liberal Russian Tsar Alexander II in 1881. People's Will, a very extreme revolutionary socialist or anarchist group, pioneered the use of dynamite, which had been invented in the 1860s by Alfred Nobel in their attacks. They took inspiration from Sergei Nechayev, who was in prison at the time of the assassination of the Tsar. He had already managed to alienate almost everyone across Europe by basically being very insane and interpersonally horrible, and also telling everyone to die for the revolution and cut all human ties, except those they could manipulate to advance the cause. So a real OG black pill guy, I guess. After Johann Most was released from British prison in 1882 for his incitements to violence following the Tsar's death, which he thought was awesome, he moved to New York and then Chicago's German-American communities and took up revolutionary anarchist agitation there, promoting dynamite attacks. He actually began facilitating the acquisition of dynamite to associated radicals. He was routinely imprisoned, including after McKinley's assassination. We're getting to that in a second, after which he praised it in similar terms to his comments on the Tsar. He also famously said, quote, "Whoever looks at America will see. The ship is powered by stupidity, corruption, or prejudice," end quote, which, fair enough. And he said in support of propaganda of the deed attacks on the elite that, quote, "The existing system will be the quickest and most radically overthrown by the annihilation of its exponents. Therefore, massacres of the enemies of the people must be set in motion," end quote. Non-immigrant anarchists of the more pacifist school, like Benjamin Tucker, so again, that's what we talked about at the very beginning, those proto-American, pre-industrial, individualist anarchists tended to be very pacifist, but were not really immigrants or associated with the immigrant community, publicly accused Most and his radical associates not just of dynamite attacks, but also of a series of apartment fires across New York City's on their own properties that left many civilians dead, which he claimed was for insurance fraud. This, I don't know if it's ever been proven. It's probably hard to prove one way or the other, but basically he was trying to contend that the anarchists had some, communal housing that they had set on fire and killed people to try to get insurance money. That's probably not true, but it didn't go over very well that the accusation was made. Also, and this goes back to one of the people Rachel brought up, Johann Most got horsewhipped across the face by Emma Goldman when she was young because she got very mad at his criticism of Alexander Berkman, who was her romantic partner at the time. He had attempted to assassinate Henry Clay Frick during the Homestead Strike, which we talked about on a previous episode and which Rachel talked about earlier. And she didn't like that Most was criticizing her boyfriend. Berkman later actually launched an anarchist magazine called The Blast in a nod to the dynamite attacks that were favored by Most, which is fun. And Most, his nickname was Dynamost because he loved dynamite so much. Again, probably the most famous assassination in the United States was of McKinley, or at least anarchist assassination, I should say, of President McKinley in 1901 at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo by Leon Czolgosz. But Czolgosz was inspired by the assassination of Umberto I, the King of Italy, in 1900, which was done by Gaetano Bresci. And so there was, at this point, a very clear association between the Italian-American anarchists and these bombing attacks and so forth, and shootings. And, we still see some elements of this today, as we were talking about at the beginning. The modern version, you'd talk about insurrectionary anarchist cells from the 1990s to the present, clashing with security forces, doing black bloc tactics. That's kind of the most closely descended thing from these propaganda of the deed attacks, but even that I would hesitate to blur that together too much. These cells in the 90s tended to be tied to the Latin American anarchist and trade unionist groups, or to Quebec anarchists, which not a lot of that left anymore. And obviously, we saw the more peaceful modern anarchists being involved in things like Occupy Wall Street, but less emphasizing clashing with police than insurrectionary cells. And again, I think it's key to really draw a distinction here between ideology and tactics, because the waters got kind of muddied by the coverage. Because again, people like Most arriving in the U.S. just ahead of when the Haymarket bombing happens, and him actively promoting and trying to supply dynamite to various anarchists, you can see how the government and the ownership class and stuff were able to manipulate this against those folks. Nate, did you want to comment a little bit about this propaganda of the deed sort of approach from the Russians and Italians?
Well, I would just say there was an incident recently where there was an anarchist who was like firebombing ICE vehicles. So that's sort of in the same category, but not exactly the same. Like, he didn't kill anyone or wasn't really trying to. So that was more just like direct action to disrupt the mechanisms of the state or whatever. So.
And Rachel, presumably you see the connection here as well to the, the assassination of the governor of Idaho and the subsequent trial, which we alluded to earlier.
Yeah. Although I believe it wasn't really determined whether it was an agent provocateur or an actual anarchist that blew up Governor Studenberg.
Right. And that
right.
line is kind of always blurry, right? Is it a lone wolf propaganda of the deed anarchist who legitimately believes in this, or is it someone who's, doing this on behalf of some reactionary force as a pretext?
Right, and I believe there are some theories that it was also a provocateur during the Haymarket affair as well. So it's, like you said, it's always kind of a blurred line and pretty ambiguous most of the time.
All right. Well, we are nearing the close of this combo episode here on American syndicalism and anarchism, and it's time to finally talk more specifically about the first Red Scare, which, as Nate said earlier, tended to focus much more heavily on anarchists and syndicalists than it did on communists, although obviously they also came in for their fair share of persecution as well, but not in the same way as the second Red Scare under the McCarthy era. So let's talk about this other book that I read, Criminal Syndicalism Legislation in the United States, which was published by Eldridge Dowell in 1935. I found this book absolutely fascinating, although I don't think he ever wrote anything else. I don't know whatever happened to him. I wasn't able to find that out. But this book, is being written not quite in the heat of the moment, but it's pretty contemporaneous. It's a lot closer to the period in question than we are now. And it's a very interesting perspective on what had happened. And this was like a PhD dissertation that this guy wrote published in 1935. He went, all over the U.S., like poring over various newspaper records and so forth and tracking this. So we've talked about in the part one episode, we talked about sort of the formation of the IWW and them being on the precipice of potentially a new moment in 1916. And then the next year, the U.S. enters World War I, Russia falls to the Bolsheviks, and everything sort of changes at that point. So let's talk about what happened then to American syndicalism and as a whole, rather than just these sort of specific high-profile prosecutions like the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. So many states, especially after World War I, passed state laws against revolutionary communists, revolutionary syndicalists from 1917 to 1921 particularly, and also, to a lesser extent, against Nazis who were beginning to take power in this period too. These ranged from restrictions on the use of public grounds for assembly, to restrictions on ballot eligibility, to bans on red flags, to literature distribution bans, and to various laws against industrial sabotage that was intended to achieve industrial or political objectives. Now, many of these laws were so similar in wording that Eldridge Dowell, who wrote the book, was able to count which repeat sections had been passed into law in which U.S. state or territory. So, for example, 15 states and two territories had virtually identical laws, making it a felony to engage in or advocate for syndicalism. And 11 states even banned teaching about syndicalism as a theory or practice. And this, to my mind, as I was reading this book, you cannot help but think about the current day context of the ALEC laws, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council, where they are sending around model conservative legislation, copied and pasted, to different state legislatures and all trying to get them passed at the same point. I think this is probably the first time, if I had to guess, when this happened on this level of sort of systematic approach, was in this 1917 to 1921 period. And Rachel, do you want to talk about Idaho, as it's actually pretty noteworthy within the context of this book?
Yeah. So Idaho had perhaps the most draconian law on industrial action. They passed it in 1925. Idaho alone includes in the definition of sabotage such things as loitering, improperly done work, waste, publication of trade secrets, and slowing down of work or production. And all 19 Progressive Party legislators in Idaho voted against the bill. It's interesting to note in today's context that the Progressive Party was an extant party in Idaho, which is kind of inconceivable today. And it's interesting that they had such a draconian law and such harsh language, because two adjoining states, Utah and Montana, had the lightest punishments in terms of fine size and potential jail time, and while South Dakota had a fine of up to $10,000 and potential jail time of 25 years. Typically, 10 years was the most common limit and $5,000 the most common fine. So it's kind of interesting how even states that were in the same region varied so greatly in their definitions of sabotage and their punishments for such actions.
Yeah, I mean, imagine getting 25 years in jail for slowing down your work production line at a factory. I mean, that's essentially, that's what that's the level of what they were trying to go for in an attempt to crush this, basically. I think that, as we've talked about before, a lot of this is the context of the actual Russian Revolution happening is oh, this is no longer theoretical. They actually could potentially institute a worker state. And so just nipping it all in the bud if they could, it was a huge thing. Now, Dowell stresses in the book that the IWW, both in its resolutions, constitution, and philosophy, were not a violent organization, although these laws were explicitly geared toward cracking down on the IWW. Their vision of a general strike leading to the dismantling of the bourgeois political state was a peaceful vision, and violence was only to be used defensively if fired upon or otherwise attacked physically. They did not consider property destruction to be violence, obviously, although that has been something I think that is also a resonant theme today, which is, we saw these protests and riots happen, from 2014 onward, especially around police brutality, and you had a very clear section of the American public and the media as a whole that believed that property destruction where no one is hurt is also violence. And that is sort of a key problem if you have a syndicalist approach like the IWW. If you're we're pacifist, but we're also not afraid to smash some physical things, that, I guess, bothered some people. In 1917, the IWW formally dropped the use of the term sabotage. They considered sabotage in the European context to be a more general thing of, work slowdowns and things like that, not necessarily property damage, but they decided that property damage is what the public associated with the word sabotage, so they didn't want to confuse people. The media was pretty unhelpful toward the IWW and often repeated uncritically fantastical claims about violence and damage, according to Dowell's review of newspapers of the period. For example, the Seattle mayor insisted in early 1918 that a large-scale labor strike by 110 local unions was actually a failed Bolshevik IWW October Revolution being staged in Seattle, which is completely insane. And he said a year later, newspapers were still citing this as a case study on Bolshevik revolutionary coup attempts on American soil. Earlier during the war, before the Russian Revolution, most news stories insisted that the German Kaiser was financing the IWW's operations all over the U.S. and that he had publicly praised the IWW's German members, which doesn't really hold up to common sense in my view, given his views about the left as a whole. And also, a lot of the IWW wasn't German. It was Italian or Latino or whatever. So unclear on that point. A major outlier state, unsurprisingly, given our recent episodes, was Wisconsin, where the legislature managed to run out the clock on an anti-syndicalism bill and never bring it to a final vote. The conservative Republican governor who requested the bill hated the IWW, but socialist Milwaukee Mayor Dan Hoan was, I guess, more sympathetic to the IWW than some of his socialist predecessors who had tried to purge the, IWW from the Socialist Party and that kind of thing. He tried to shield the IWW from state efforts and said they had never given the city of Milwaukee any trouble and he wasn't going to start any. Most of the opposition to the bill in Wisconsin came from a coalition of state house reps from the socialists, the unions, the farm groups, the progressives, and the liberals. Now, they never actually voted it down. They just used a lot of procedural tactics and endless amendments to gum up the works until the session clock ran out. No newspapers in Wisconsin endorsed the bill, and that included one that was very openly anti-IWW. So one of the common features was that usually a law would get adopted with very, a short time frame. It would get introduced. A newspaper would endorse it locally. It would get voted through, sometimes unanimously, which probably means they didn't even take a voice vote. They just said it. All those in favor and any objections, But in this case, they didn't have that, so that kind of was a stumbling block as well. Nate, do you want to talk here about the bill introduced in Massachusetts and why that failed?
Yeah, so there was a bill in Massachusetts that was also introduced, but it did not make it out of committee. There was a big coalition of liberals, union members, anti-war groups, civil liberties advocates, and some prominent local American Legion members who also opposed it. And apparently American Legion in most states was actively pushing for these laws. So this was sort of a reversal. And foundational to the mythology around here, one opponent testified the Boston Tea Party would clearly have been the type of political property sabotage the bill sought to ban. And we do love the Boston Tea Party sort of myth here, or whatever it is. So I guess that would make sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly doesn't really hold up to scrutiny of the actual history, but you're right. In terms of the mythology, that's sort of the key to understanding that. And as you said, the American Legion was absolutely pivotal in pushing this all over the country. This is a long episode, so I'm not going to get into the role of the American Legion in any depth here. It's a fascinating read in this book, which, again, the title of that is Criminal Syndicalism Legislation in the United States. It's long out of print. I had to request it from a distant library in Massachusetts. They were sort of the proto-ALEC of this time period, of circulating these bills as they were coming home from World War I, basically as there wasn't like in the immediate aftermath of World War I, there was no sort of nascent fascist movement in the way that there were in some of the European countries. But if you had anything approaching that, it probably would have been the American Legion. And that is why it is so important in Massachusetts that key American Legion figures actually opposed the bill as opposed to trying to ram it through. And some of the reason that it didn't end up spreading beyond a lot of the states that it was passed in is because after a while, the sort of momentum waned. The areas, either you got into states where the syndicalists were too strong to take on, or you got into areas where they just didn't have a significant presence, or you had situations where the American Legion energy on this had kind of dissipated toward other things. But the other... as I just said, one reason that a lot of the bills didn't get passed in various states was because there were areas where the syndicalists really were not that strong of a presence. And that was particularly true in the South. Now, we talked a little bit about some of the IWW successes around the lumber industry and having racially integrated unions and so forth. But for the most part, the Southern bills, they'd get introduced, but then they wouldn't go anywhere and nobody really pushed it because it wasn't a big concern. Instead, the Southern legislators were much more focused on anti-communist legislation, and that is because, as we talked about on the recent episode, communists organizing black agricultural sharecroppers rather than syndicalist industrial action were seen as the bigger threat to the political order there. And they were not really able to lump the two issues together in a way that would garner enough support for passage. There were also repeated attempts at federal bills to make syndicalism a crime, and these were unsuccessful during the war. They were also unsuccessful just after the war. They passed in the conservative U.S. Senate, which, of course, is the same U.S. Senate that did things like kill the League of Nations and that sort of thing. And it passed a few times there, but it never got anywhere in the House. And there were even some supporters who acknowledged publicly that while they were able to get away with quite a lot of pretty sketchy laws around like First Amendment rights and stuff during the war, they were not going to be able to get away with that in the courts after the war ended. It was going to be held unconstitutional, so they didn't really push it too heavily at the federal level. All right, so that's it. We got through our 26 pages of notes here on American anarchism and syndicalism, covering a wide range of theory and practice there in a sort of forgotten chapter. Nate, I'll go to you first on your sort of overarching, thoughts on all of this and kind of, any relevant lessons for today and that sort of thing.
I mean, there's a rich history here, as we've seen, and it does seem like there is a upsurge of maybe not necessarily anarchist in the same sense that we've talked about here, but at least anarchist-inspired organization and activities, in addition to sort of the upswing in socialist organization as well. So sort of goes hand in hand in a lot of respects. There was that long history there even before some of the more, the socialist parties are working alongside them. So, I mean, hopefully we'll see more of that type, maybe a little less bomb throwing, maybe, but we'll see.
Rachel.
Something that just kind of kept going through my head was same as it ever was, because we've seen these concerns about property damage and people using violence or even falsely being accused of using violence to further their political goals. So it's just kind of interesting to see how that's playing out now, trying to criminalize anti-fascist quote unquote organization, even though it's a decentralized, non-organizational movement. So it's just kind of familiar. And I guess we should look to what failed in the past to kind of shape how we move forward. Like maybe a completely decentralized movement isn't quite the way to go because it's hard to maintain momentum and maintain that support in an area after assisting with workers movements in various locales. We got to maintain a presence and kind of build that power, that workers' power, and not just kind of fade away into the ether like it seems like the IWW did during a lot of those workers' movements.
One of the themes that I was thinking about, and then I'll get back to you in a second, Nate, is that there's some things that don't seem that relevant today. Like it's, we obviously have a much smaller, manufacturing base in this country. We have a lot more like white collar professionals and technology jobs and things like that are, they seem completely different. And it's definitely like, it can be a challenge to motivate, white collar professionals to get into one big union and usher in the syndicalist revolutionary state, I think. But on the other hand, we've also seen that some of the huge gains in union organizing recently have been in organizing, more migrant workers, more transient workers, service workers, restaurant jobs with high turnover, things like that previously seemed, quote, unorganizable. And that to me feels like a lot of this sort of legacy of the trade unionism, the syndicalism, without necessarily the revolutionary aspect maybe, but in terms of the organizing people where they are, and in like the agricultural workers organization, right before World War I that was part of the IWW. That's something that was kind of going through my head. Nate?
Well, yeah, I mean the IWW still does exist, and they still do organize workers, and as you've said, that we're facing a situation where a lot of people don't have a union, or they may not have official papers or employment, things like that. So there is absolutely a place for the IWW and its organizational methods to continue.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's hard to look at, a situation where you have large. It's not even just immigrants being denied the right to vote, right? It's the same thing that we had in the Jim Crow era.
Burger flippers.
You have people that are totally disenfranchised. Their right to vote is totally suppressed. The idea that you're gonna, and I'm not making a case here of like, oh, renounce electoralism and, choose revolutionary syndicalism. Like that obviously is not what I'm saying. But like the idea that you can win everything through the ballot box, I think a lot of people are really starting to take another hard look at that and say, is that really realistic? Is that a viable pathway, especially in a country like the United States, where so many people either legally do not have the right to vote, and I think that's going to get tougher with increasing immigration controls and nativist policy making, as well as just not having the access to their right to vote because of various sort of gerrymandering and voter ID laws and felony disenfranchisement and things like that. And of course, we've talked about this before, like organizing prison labor is like a huge sort of trade union syndicalist goal right now in the United States. And a lot of those folks are associated with the IWW. Like there's a lot of similar, I feel like, themes recurring now in our sort of second Gilded Age as what we saw in the first Gilded Age and the period of the early 20th century. All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being on this week to talk about these really fascinating anarchist and socialist women of this time period and some of the interesting Idaho centrality of a lot of this movement and time period.
Thanks, Bill. It's always a pleasure.
And Nate, thanks for being on this week as well, and talking to us about the Haymarket bombing and Sacco and Vanzetti and the propaganda of the deed stuff.
Thanks.